Edo-Arctic Tour, Polar Research for Education, innovative program in Poland and Norway. Webinars.
Let's start with a short introduction to Iceland. As a country, today's webinar will cover very many different aspects of the island in rather a kind of a crash course to Iceland. The country's official name is the Republic of Iceland, and its political system since the 1949 is the constitutional republic. So it's a country that elects its president and parliament. The capital city of Iceland is Reykjavik, and the language and currency are the Icelandic language and the Icelandic krona, a native currency of the land. The notable thing about Iceland is its very low population. It's less than 350,000 people. So in European terms, we can say that in Iceland, there's as many people as in a middle-sized city. And of those 350,000, one-third lives in the capital city and its surroundings. The whole country is around 103,000 kilometers. It's less than one-third of Poland. It's not very big, but also not particularly small, specifically with regard to the populations. Around 12,000 square kilometers of these is covered by ice, by glaciers, and around 30,000 square kilometers is covered by volcanoes and lava fields. So even within this rather small area, a lot is in one way or another inaccessible. The religion of Iceland is Evangelical Lutheranism. The official state church of Iceland is a Protestant church, similar to other Nordic countries. You can, of course, find out more information about Iceland in the Polarpedia. You can copy the link to your browser and read a bit more about the country, but today I hope you will stay with me on the webinar and listen to more interesting information. Let's start with a little bit of history of Iceland. The earliest mention of the country may be the relations given by a Greek sailor Pythias of Massalia in the 3rd century before the current era, but his claims of seeing the land of Thule is rather controversial, although the tales of Thule say of the sea that's so thick and dense that it's impossible to travel through it by ship or on foot, which might fit the description of ice-covered ocean. The modern scholars believe that the Thule referred to by the ancients is not exactly Iceland, but some island that's closer to Britain, like the Orcades or even parts of Norway. The very first people who actually settled on Iceland were most probably Irish monks who traveled north from Ireland in search of places for solitude and meditation, and they might have shown up on Iceland in the 8th century of current era, but we only have scarce archaeological remains record to confirm that. The first settlers that stayed on Iceland for longer time were the Viking, the Norse people from Norway most probably, who arrived around the year 830, 850 current era. And they managed to develop and sustain settlement there, and in the year 930, the first meeting of the Icelandic parliament, the Althing, was held. At the time, it was a meeting of the chiefs of local tribes and communities. To this day, it's being held in various forms. Currently, Althing is a modern typical parliament as we know it from Europe. At the time, Althing was meeting in a valley close to Reykjavik that was the rift valley between the two continents. In the year 1000, Iceland has switched peacefully to Christianity from the Norse beliefs, but since there was no active persecution of pagans or any kind of this thing we might have known from Europe, the memory of the old Norse beliefs survived, and Iceland is one of the most important sources for our knowledge of the Norse beliefs. In the 13th century, Iceland agreed to pay taxes to the King of Norway, effectively losing its independence and becoming a part of Norway under the Norwegian king, and that started an era of dependence of Iceland on its Nordic overlords. First, the Norway was the dominant country. Then, around 1380, Iceland became the possession of Denmark and remained a part of Denmark until 1944. So, for the most of its recorded history. In 1904, Iceland gained autonomy, so we can see for a very long time the island was really a colony without much of its own rights and laws for independence, for its self-governance. And in the 1918, after the First World War, Iceland gained limited independence under its own flag that it holds to this day. But the King of Denmark remained the head of state of Iceland, so it was still, in a way, dependent on the Danish rule. Then the Second World War came, and in 1940, Denmark was invaded by the Nazi Germany, and the British army showed up on Iceland to prevent its invasion from Germany, and Iceland, as well as the Faroe Islands, remained occupied by Great Britain and the United States for the entire time of the Second World War. After the war, a popular referendum plebiscite was held that decided that Iceland wants to renounce its ties to the Danish king and become an independent republic with elected president as the head of state. They adopted their own constitution and shortly after became a member of NATO, the Western military alliance. From the modern history, an episode that's very worth knowing, remembering, are the Cod Wars. They were fought against the Great Britain in a bid from Iceland to extend its right to exclusive fishing rights in the ocean around the island. In the past, these waters were an area of operation of the British fishing industry, but Iceland, as the new independent country, wanted to have greater control of these fisheries and also the exclusive rights to use them. So the Royal Coast Guard of Iceland, the only kind of military formation of the country, since Iceland does not have a regular military nor a regular navy, was protecting the Icelandic fishing vessels, while the British Navy, the regular British military navy, was protecting the British fishing vessels. The war was not really bloody. There weren't any casualties resulted from the direct conflict between the ships, and the hostile acts was mostly about cutting the fishing nets of trawlers or ramming enemy vessels. And in the diplomatic channels, Iceland managed to win what it asked for, and that is the expansion of its exclusive economic zone to progressively larger and larger piece of the ocean. So the blue sections on the map on the lower picture here show how far away is Iceland really only allowed to fish. And these matters of fishery are still a very important piece of Iceland's economy. This is why it's a point of dispute between Iceland and European Union. You might have heard that Iceland is not a part of European Union, and this is, among others, because the European Union requires all member states to share their fishing resources and their fishing areas. And Iceland is very fiercely opposed to this policy, and it's not willing to share their fish with other countries, with a very fair argument that they are able to exploit those areas sustainably, and it's not guaranteed from other countries. Now let's move to the geology and landscape of Iceland. The most important geological feature that of Iceland that is the reason of its whole landscape form and virtually everything is its location on the mid-Atlantic ridge, that is on the border between the Eurasian tectonic plate on the east and the American tectonic plate on the west. The two tectonic plates are moving apart from each other at a rate of around 2 centimeters per year. It seems very small, very slow, but in the realm of geology, it's a rather considerable speed. And Iceland is a part of the oceanic crust, which rose above the surface of the ocean in a long series of volcanic eruption and lava spills. It's a very geologically young piece of land. All its rocks were formed less than 25 million years ago, and we can make a comparison that if the entire age of the Earth, all the several billion years, the Iceland would only be around for 2 days. So it's all formed of very, very young rocks. And even despite that, the surface of Iceland has been changing very dynamically in this short time, both as it expanded and grew due to lava flows and volcanic eruptions, and also due to erosion caused mostly by the glaciers of the island. The oldest geological history of Iceland begins around 55 million years ago, when a huge Laurentian plate became cracking and separating into the Greenland and Canada and the European continental edges, and as it expanded, the rift zone in between was formed, and a magma hotspot that was moving along this rift. The ridge creates first an underwater bridge between Greenland and Scotland, and later, as the lava moves above the ocean surface, it creates Iceland. This geological map shows us the current geological situation. The gray parts are the cold rock. Let's call it like that. The gray part is the part of Iceland that is not active volcanically in the current age. It's the oldest rocks of the island, and the orange part is the area that is still currently volcanically tectonically active in the middle of it, the mid-Atlantic ridge is located, and is the reason for the entire expansion and activity. These oldest parts of Iceland are currently inactive. As I said, these are the two examples in the northwestern and southeastern part of the island, since these parts had a very long time to be eroded without much of new land being created. These are the lands of very long, very deep fjords and tall magma cliffs. The flat surface of the island, as you can see on these images, we have fairly flat mountains surrounding those fjords, and this is a very clear sign of the glacial erosion, as the glacier was moving along those valleys, along these areas, and smoothing out the relief. Younger lava flows that are present in the center of the island, can sometimes, they did and they still sometimes are occurring under the glaciers. Sometimes the volcano can erupt, or a lava spill can occur under the glacier, and it did occur much more often in the past when the entire island was covered by ice sheets. In this situation, a table mountain, a single tall mountain sticking out of the landscape, can form as lava first melts its way through the ice, building this kind of chimney, and then solidifies surrounded by the ice that constrains its outflow, building this kind of a tall singular pillar. Sometimes, on the other hand, the lava flow shows the characteristic of pillow lava, and instead of burning through the glacier to its top, cools down underneath the ice in pools of subglacial water, and creating much wider and shorter lava formations. This is a satellite image of Iceland in summer. So the only ice cover we can see are the glaciers. And in the middle, this black part, if you can see in the middle of the island, the black strip between the greens is the area of the fresh lava fields. The youngest volcanic formations, the youngest volcano from the last several thousands and millions of years, have built lava plains and the tallest mountains of Iceland. And since those volcanoes were and still are among the tallest mountains on the island, they still are most often covered by glaciers, since they much prefer to form on tall mountains. Nowadays, eruptions of eruptions of volcanoes, often also underneath the glaciers, are still common and occurring, such as the Vatnajuku in 2010, or the very recent eruption that is not underneath the glacier, but is building a new lava field in the southwestern part of the island, and evidences the activity of the earth there. The subglacial volcanic activity is not only causing creation of landforms, but also requires, or maybe not requires, but causes melting of ice. When very hot lava arrives underneath a glacier, the ice has to melt, since the very hot lava touches very cold ice, and suddenly very, very large amounts of water are available for the outflow. And sudden massive glacial floods, very fast, very sudden floods, occur in such cases. In Icelandic, they are called jökullaups, and this word jökullaup has even entered the International Geographical Dictionary. In English, they are sometimes this kind of sudden subglacial volcanic floods are called jökullaups, and this water from jökullaup usually follows the channels of existing glacial rivers. Iceland has many rivers that flow from underneath the glacier as the ice melts in its natural pace, and this water carries away huge amounts of debris, of sand, gravel, from underneath the glacier. And as the water flows toward the ocean, all of this material, all of these grains of rock are deposited and dropped and create very wide sandy plains and beaches. And these plains and beaches of sand are known as sandurs, also a word coming from the Icelandic language. And since the whole of Iceland is built of volcanic material, those beaches are actually black. The sand is black, the gravel is black, and they form a very picturesque setting used often by filmmakers or music video makers when they want to show landscape of other worlds, like other planets or some mystical realms. Due to all those things that I have mentioned previously, sedimentary rocks are very rare in Iceland, and they are mostly these sandurs that I have described before. Inside those rare sedimental rocks are even rarer brown coal lignite deposits, but these are very thin deposits and very rare, so currently they are not used for any economic reasons. It's not used as a viable source of fuel, but they are an evidence that in the past, in the geological past, Iceland was for a brief time covered by rich, lush vegetation. But the development of ice caps during the ice ages caused the destruction of this vegetation, and all that it remained from it were the brown coal deposits as an evidence. Now again, this is an exercise. I think it's one of the exercises from the worksheet and from the larger educational package. But this little map shows the volcanoes on Iceland. There are 180 volcanoes mapped on Iceland, and 30 of which were active in the historical times, that is, in the time that we have any historical records of people who were there and could see those glaciers erupting. Aside of that, geological methods allowed us to trace those eruptions much further into the past, but these are, of course, less well known. Iceland is notable for having very many different kinds of volcanoes. We have flat lava cones that are able to spew lava for months at a time. We have very tall and explosive stratovolcanoes. We have glacial crevices that are seeping lava along large areas. And the lava cover, the fresh lava covers, fresh in geological setting, of course, covers around 23% of the Iceland surface and is the youngest rock. So this blue area here on the map shows where Iceland is currently growing. Anytime a new volcano eruption occurs, a new lava field is created, it means that the Iceland has grown by this little amount. Now, the glaciers are another important feature of Iceland's landscape. They cover around 12%, and they are currently mostly ice caps developed on the tallest, highest mountain ranges or single volcanoes. The biggest and largest of them is Vatnajuku. It's also known as the largest ice cap of Europe, also contested for the spot with an ice cap in Novaya Zemlya in Russia. But besides that, we have several smaller ice caps that cover several or single mountains. Many of those glaciers are really hard to reach and to observe, but some of them, particularly glacier tongues that descend from them, can be easily accessed even by an unprepared tourist. We can literally drive up to the edge of a glacier tongue and after a short walk touch the glacier's front. So not only are they quite omnipresent, but some of them are also easy to see and to reach. The Vatnajuku, the largest one, is, as I mentioned, the largest in Europe. The second or first one is the one in Russia, and the third is in Svalbard. Vatnajökull has multiple outlet glaciers that flow down the valleys from the main ice cap and covers several volcanoes, which sometimes cause problems, like the Eyjafjallajökull volcano that has erupted underneath a glacier and caused a stop to the European air traffic 10 years ago. A very notable important part of Vatnajökull's outlet glacier, a very notable one, is Breiðamerkurjökull, that terminates in a valley known as Jökulsárlón. It's a very famous tourist spot, a lake filled with icebergs that break off the Breiðamerkurjökull, and it's located very close to the Icelandic coast, to the ocean. And a road, very easily accessible, drives around this lake. So many tourists love to come to Jökulsárlón to watch not only the glacier, but also the icebergs. Now let's move on to the climate of the country. As you can guess, it's much cooler than in Europe, but it's not, at least in the southern part of the island, it's not as severe as one may imagine from a place so far up in the north, due to the Gulf Stream that carries warm water along the Atlantic Ocean. So the southern part of Iceland is cool, is very snowy in winter, but the summer are cool from our perspective, but the winters are relatively mild, with temperatures between -5 to 0 degrees Celsius. And that's the cool temperate climate zone in the south. But the northern part of Iceland is much harsher. It actually qualifies to a different climate zone, the subpolar climate zone. And the climate in the north is much cooler. The temperature can fall below -10, -12, -20. The snowfall is much more severe than in the south, and the snow cover can persist for several days or weeks. This very cool temperature of winter makes it that the average temperatures of those places in the north, like the Greinivik illustrated on this graph, can be as low as 1 degree Celsius, the average. As this graph shows, the summer average temperatures are below 10 degrees Celsius, so they are as cool in summer as we are in the autumn. The rivers of Iceland are derived mostly from glaciers. The meltwater from the glaciers flows downwards through the valleys and plains. As I have shown you before, the debris, the sand carried by those rivers, is then deposited, sometimes closer to the coast, sometimes farther away. But as the map of network of rivers in Iceland shows us, most of them take their source in glaciers. And since there is so many glaciers and so much water, and so much rain as well on Iceland, the country can boast very extensive river network, and they are using it for electricity that I will tell you about later. Besides of that, the dramatic landscape of Iceland means that sometimes those rivers reach cliffs or other kinds of sudden breaks in terrain and create huge waterfalls that then, of course, continue flowing through picturesque valleys. This is the Skogafoss Waterfall, one of the largest ones. That's how waterfalls look most often in Iceland. They appear out of nowhere from a tall topographic feature. And while Skogafoss is relatively, it's one of the largest, but still relatively small, the largest, hugest ones like Gullfoss here carry big amounts of water, particularly during melt season or during those Jökulhlaups, and carve very, very deep river valleys like the one pictured on this photograph of Jerzy Giżejewski. Now let's move on to the animals of Iceland. And now some interesting facts about Icelandic fauna. Before the Vikings showed up in the 9th century, there was only one land mammal on Iceland, and that was the Arctic fox. Very rarely a polar bear appears in the north of Iceland when carried with a piece of sea ice, but these are very, very rare occurrences both today and in the past. The settlers brought with them horses, cows, sheep, and so the inventory of mammals and larger animals expanded. The Iceland has no amphibians and no reptiles, so really no lizards, no frogs on the island. But to compensate for all of that, they have around 350 different bird species, 100 of which are seabirds. The location of Iceland in the middle of the ocean makes it a very, very convenient spot for birds to nest, to live, to rest. And the most famous of the Icelandic birds is the puffin. The one shown on the lower image here on this slide. It looks a little bit like a sad penguin with a colorful beak, and this is the iconic bird of Iceland. When you go to Reykjavik, when you visit the place, all tourist shops will sell gadgets or toys or magnets with the puffin's face on it because it's so known and famed among Icelanders. In the sea, the notable mention about the marine fauna is 23 species of whales and dolphins that show up around Iceland and can be watched by people as well as 6 species of seals and walruses. And as I have mentioned before, the waters around Iceland are a very rich and very diverse fishery environment. So we also meet numerous species of fish around Iceland, of which the cod is the most economically important. From among the animals that are herded by people are the Icelandic horses. They are considered a specific endemic breed for Iceland. Those Icelandic horses are rather small. They are also sometimes called Icelandic ponies. They are breeded nowadays mostly for non-economic reasons. They are not used for working the fields or traveling anymore. In the past, of course, they were among the most important animals for the inhabitants of Iceland. Sometimes they're used for herding sheep, but it's more of an add-on than the main reason to breed them. And due to the pride of Icelandic breeders, they take very good care about their horses and forbid any foreign Icelandic horse breeders to bring their horses to Iceland. You can find Icelandic horses outside Iceland. Some people in Europe, in America are breeding them, but they are not allowed to bring them to Iceland to not spoil the original population of these horses. Now moving to plants, the plant life on Iceland. The most common plant formations are grasslands and tundra, so they are rather assemblages of short plants. Many species of the plants that are found commonly on Iceland sometimes are also encountered in Central Europe in the high mountains, in the Alps or in Tatra mountains, like mountain avens or the alpine rose. There are hundreds of species of mosses and lichens living on Iceland. On Iceland, around 2,000 species of mushrooms and numerous species of algae, but these are the most important ones. The vegetation of Iceland is rather sparse. The plant cover is rather patchy and interspersed with areas of naked rock. Icelandic tundra is the northernmost biome of Earth that's typical for the Arctic islands. It has very short growing season, very strong winds, as parts of central Iceland have poor precipitation and poor soil, so the plants are very short. The permafrost, the layer of perennially frozen ground, is one of the reasons why trees or bushes do not show up in this tundra, since they are not able to penetrate the frozen ground with their roots. The climate in the coast is obviously much different, with a much greater amount of rain, much milder temperatures than the interior of the island, so the vegetation in the coastal areas is richer than in the tundra in the middle and northeastern part of the island. The forests of Iceland are a fairly interesting topic. In the beginning of human settlement, we know from the Norse sagas, when the Vikings first showed up in the island, the coastal lowlands were overgrown with forests. So the climate, the natural conditions were, and to a degree still are, quite okay for forests. But the settlers needed a lot of this wood to build their houses, to build their ships, to warm themselves, and that led to chopping out of the entire forest stock of Iceland. And since the Little Ice Age came in the Middle Ages and the climate became cooler, the forests had a much harder time to reconstruct, to rebuild themselves. Only at the beginning of the 20th century, the Icelanders started to rebuild their forests. Currently, the largest forest area is in the northeastern part of the island, around the lake of Lugurin. The forest has to not only be protected from climate in which it is able to grow, but also from the animals. Northeastern Iceland has a small population of reindeer. The whole Iceland has a lot of sheep that are all a threat to young trees, since those animals like to eat the short trees or to stomp on them, and thus prevent their growth. So at the beginning of the forest's life, it had to be protected from the animals. Currently, it covers around 740 square kilometers. It's not much in European terms. It's a surface area comparable to a big city, like bigger than Warsaw, but still it's not something that we associate with European or American forests. Then in 1903 a nursery was established there, and a lot of seedlings for afforestation in the entire island were sourced from there. Nowadays, Iceland is not a forest island, absolutely, but the efforts are ongoing, and the Forest Authority wants to restore parts of this natural Viking Age forest in some places of the island. Icelanders are very proud of their nature, and they protect it very strongly with various kinds of protection measures like national parks, nature reserves, country parks. All of these serve to protect this this rare and sometimes fragile environment, mainly from the numerous tourists that started to show up on Iceland in recent years. Let's now move to the economic part of this presentation. We'll start with a short slide about the energy sector of Iceland. Iceland generates its energy from sustainable sources. The hydro energy and geothermal energy are the most important sources of power and warmth on the island. Wind energy and fossil fuels are marginal sources of power for Icelanders, and this makes the country famous for its cheap and green energy. The hydroelectric power plants currently cover 80% of electricity demand, and as this power is fairly cheap, the country became a place for energy-intensive industry to show up and develop. For example, aluminum smelting, which requires huge amounts of energy. Some aluminum smelting plants were built on the island, and for example, the Vatnajuku power plant, the hydropower plant that we see on the image of this large artificial lake, was built with the specific purpose of powering an aluminum smelting plant. Agriculture is not an important part of Icelandic economy. Only 1% is occupied by agricultural land that's okay for growing crops. The sheep are a big part of Iceland's agriculture, as the country has around 1 million sheep in the peak of the herding season, much more than the population of humans. The most commonly grown crops are hay and potatoes, and as you can see, those numbers are really, really small of what is grown on Iceland. The vegetables or fruit are grown in greenhouses, but if we look at the numbers, the 13,134 tons of tomatoes is not very much. It amounts to around to very small amount of tomatoes, so a lot of food of Iceland has to be imported, particularly plants. On the other hand, the marine agriculture, the fish catching is an important part of the economy. Iceland's fishing industry mostly relies on cod, mackerel, capelin, and blue whiting. and they are exporting really big amounts of both fresh and frozen fish. And looking at this is a chart of exports of the Iceland economy. We can see that the aluminum and fish are the most important export products of Iceland, contributing more than 2/3 of its export. The other important part of Iceland's economy, some say the most important one, is the tourism. It's the largest sector of Iceland's economy, at least as of before the pandemic. Since 2010, when the country became famous due to a volcanic eruption and an economic crisis that made traveling to Iceland cheap, the island is living through a tourist boom. Every year, more than 1 million, sometimes even 2 million people were visiting Iceland to see the country. Most often, people want to see unique landscapes that are really something that can't be seen in other parts of Europe or the US, as well as its animals, most importantly whale watching trips and bird watching trips. And in winter, a lot of tourists show up to see northern lights. The culture of Iceland also became famous together with this tourist boom. As of now, it's a fairly homogeneous ethnically country. The Icelanders are 91% of the population. The most numerous immigrant groups are Poles, and the other ones are spread among different nationalities, mostly from Europe and Asia. The official language of Iceland is Icelandic, that belongs to the Northern Germanic group and is related to Swedish or Norwegian or Danish. It is notable for having changed comparatively little with regard to the medieval Old Norse language, which means that for Icelanders, reading the medieval sagas is much easier than for other Nordic nations, since their language has not changed that much, even though the sagas were written in the 11th to 13th century. The Icelandic alphabet nowadays is a modified Latin alphabet, so it looks like our alphabet, with several special characters added that are inspired by the Old Norse runes. The literature of Iceland has a very long and rich tradition. The medieval sagas that were written as the first monuments of the Icelandic language were concerned both with the mythologies and fairy tales and myths, as well as more realistic and mundane topics like stories and histories from families, stories of the heroes, and the chronicles of the history of the events on Iceland. Nowadays, Iceland is still one of the world's leading countries in terms of readership. Icelanders read a lot of books and write a lot of books, with around 1 million copies of new books published every year in a country, let me remind you, of less than 500,000 people. Probably the most famous contemporary writer of Iceland is Halldór Kiljan Laxness. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature, while Einar Már Guðmundsson won the Nordic Council Literature Prize, also a prestigious award for the northern writers. But for most of us, probably more interesting are the crime stories. Iceland is, just like other Nordic countries, famous nowadays for crime books, for crime stories that are set on Iceland, written by Icelandic authors. They are not only engaging crime stories, and they have their particular climate, their atmosphere of so-called Nordic noir, but also very often offer an insight into life on Iceland, into how the Icelanders deal with their problems and what kind of issues are troubling their society nowadays. Some of the most famous authors of Icelandic crime are Arnaldur Indriðason, Yrsa Sigurðardóttir, and Lilja Sigurðardóttir. They are the authors that are very often translated to other languages, including English, so it shouldn't be that hard to find their books in your local bookstores. The other part of Icelandic culture that is very famous nowadays is music. While in the classical music, Iceland is not a very big country, not as famous as Austria or Germany, the Iceland Symphony Orchestra has a reputation among lovers of classical music, mostly for the works of composer Jón Leif, who was composing rather modern classical music. The opera singer Christian Johansson is also popular among opera singers, but what makes Icelandic music stand out in the world is its pop, indie, and rock music. The most famous, most successful Icelandic musician is without doubt Björk, who gained international fame. She was popular not only for her own music, but also for collaboration with different bands. She's also an actress and an avant-garde artist whose performances are very often very, very lush, colorful, and interesting. Besides that, Iceland is a big player in the fields of indie music, metal music, and groups like Sigur Rós or Skalmöld, Ólafur Arnalds, Kælan, Mikla, Moom, and many, many more are known mostly to people who attend festivals, music festivals, but anyone who was interested in these genres most probably encountered one or another Icelandic musician. And also the Iceland Airways Festival of Popular Music that is held yearly in Reykjavik for more than 20 years now is an important spot of the musical map of Europe and gathers a lot of visitors from the whole world. The other recently famous part of Icelandic pop culture is cinema. Icelandic movies became known in the last several decades, mostly due to their characteristic atmosphere of life in this faraway island with harsh climate. The movies are often contemplative, they have atmospheric photography, but despite that, they are very original. They have topics that sometimes derive from the Icelandic life and sometimes are more universal. Some of the most famous Icelandic movies from the recent years are Fusi, Rams, or Woman at War. And the potential of Icelandic cinema was noticed, recognized by international producers. And for example, Netflix is producing several Icelandic series such as Katla, Fortitude, or Trapped, which are all filmed on Iceland and very often created by Icelandic authors. The architecture of Iceland has two facets. One of it is their old buildings, and there aren't many old buildings in Iceland. The oldest one is in Reykjavik. It was built in 1764. The old buildings are rather small wooden huts, resembling what people in the even Middle Ages could live in. Some small towns have churches that present interesting vernacular architecture. What Iceland is more famous for is its contemporary architecture. The contemporary Icelandic architecture impresses with the modern shapes, with the originality of the forms and functions, like the church in Stykkishólmur on the picture number 4, or the sculptured Sculpture Gallery in Reykjavik on number 5, but undoubtedly the most famous buildings on Iceland are the Hallgrímskirkja in Reykjavik number 6 and the Harpa Concert Hall, the number 7 on the bottom in Reykjavik. These two are notable because they reference the Icelandic nature. The pillars, the hexagonal cross-section of the elements of the building are supposed to remind us of the rock formations, the volcanic rock formations of Iceland. Clickety. Now for the wrap-up, the final slide of today's webinars, I invite you to fill the crossword and fill the blanks on the worksheet that I hope you've been getting. On the platform of EduArctic 2 project, you can find all our materials available for download. If you want to revisit the Iceland or to do some interesting wrap-up exercises about it. Obviously, I invite you to all other lessons within our EduArctic 2 project. And
watch other recordings from webinars on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/eduarctic. EduArctic 2, from polar research to scientific passion, innovative nature education in Poland and Norway receives a grant of 240,000 euros received from Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway under EEA funds.